Who by fire and who by water? Who by heroin and who by fentanyl? Who by OxyContin and who by alcohol? Who will be addicted and who will be connected? Who will be sober and who will relapse? Who will feel at ease and who will be high? Who will choose their addiction over their family and whose families will be a support for them through their recovery? There's a feeling in the Jewish community that we're immune from addiction. We mask our vulnerability with sayings and jokes. Many of you might have heard, a shikker is a goy. Anyone ever hear that? Someone who's a drunk is someone who's not Jewish. Or there's another joke that goes, the Italian says, I'm thirsty, so I'm going to drink some wine. The Scotsman says, I'm thirsty, so I'm going to drink some scotch. And the Russian says, I'm thirsty, I must drink some vodka. And the Jew says, I'm thirsty, I must have diabetes. Funny, yes, but friends, we not only have alcoholism in our community, we have addictions of every variety. And don't think the glamour of the Hamptons shields us from the opioid epidemic in our country. It only intensifies it. When you learn that Suffolk County suffers the highest rates of opioid abuse in New York State, don't for a second think that it affects everyone else except the Jewish community. The most serious public health crisis in our community and perhaps in our country is substance abuse and addiction. And addiction doesn't discriminate, but we certainly have found ways to marginalize and judge those who are addicted, those who do suffer from alcoholism. We make them feel less than welcome in Jewish ritual. There was a recent study about Jews and alcohol and substance abuse, and it yielded some surprising and insightful results. Here are some of the results from the study. Ready? Jewish individuals are just as likely to be impacted by addictions as to any other ethnicity. The North American Jewish community tend to have a strong fear of alcoholics and blames individuals for their condition. Jewish addicts tend to feel alienation from Judaism because the Jewish community's unfavorable views towards them. And lastly, the study found the belief that Jews do not become alcoholics results from the leaders of the community failing to address the problem. I would like the last one not to be the case in our community. So here we are today asking the question, who by addiction? I had a first this past summer. I officiated at a wedding for a couple who met in rehab. They were both recovering addicts, and they had met each other at the lowest point in their lives. And their relationship developed by disconnecting from the substances that had gotten them hooked and connecting ever so profoundly to each other. And they became dependent not on substance, but dependent on each other. Now, this wedding would have been just like every other Jewish wedding that I had performed, that I had officiated at, except for one problem. And that is, we Jews tend to have a focus on wine. How many cups of wine, how many kiddushes are there at a Jewish wedding? Well, 2. 7 blessings, 2 kiddushes, 2 cups of wine at a traditional wedding. We say kiddush during the first part of the ceremony, known as erusin, and then yet again during the Sheva Brachot, the 7 wedding blessings, 2 cups of wine, but not to mention all the toasting that comes at any Jewish reception, also non-Jewish receptions as well. Wine is, we say, a symbol for Jewish joy. There's a part in Psalms that teaches us that wine gladdens the heart and makes us merry. And while a substitute of grape juice often suffices, it doesn't diffuse our focus on drinking. 4 cups of wine during a Passover Seder, a commandment during Purim to get so drunk that you can't tell the difference between the hero and the villain, the hero Mordecai and the villain Haman. At this sober wedding, the couple did drink some artificially flavored infused grape juice that probably was just as disgusting as Manischewitz. We managed to accommodate. I'm looking around here right now, and I know that we have those struggling with addiction, struggling with alcoholism here today. And if that's surprising to you, it shouldn't be. I even know rabbis who struggle with alcoholism and addiction. One rabbi I know has yet to share it with his congregation because he's afraid that they won't understand. He's afraid that they'll judge him even though he's been sober for numerous years. And you know what? That rabbi might be right. He might have good reason to worry. Judaism and Jews are sometimes tremendously ignorant about addiction. Even the whole richness of our literature has little to say about addiction in our community and what it means for those who suffer from alcoholism. And I'm going to say, even in the scientific and medical community, alcoholism and addiction isn't fully understood. There are many explanations, including some antiquated ones, that say that alcoholism or addiction is a moral failing. Friends, that is not the case. But then there's a lot of ideas that are put out there by different experts on addiction. We now believe that alcoholism and addiction is a disease, one that's often carried in genes. There's also a narrative and a belief which believes that substances are so chemically powerful that if you use them enough, they'll hijack your brain and change your neurochemistry. Now I'm going to add, I think I've got to say it at this point, I've got to put a full disclaimer here. I am not an expert on addiction. I'm a rabbi, and they don't teach us about addiction or alcoholism in rabbinical school. I'll also put the disclaimer and say I'm not an alcoholic, and I am not an addict, so I don't know exactly what the experience is like. But there are people who I care about deeply. There are friends and family members of mine who do suffer from alcoholism and addiction. So I've been doing a lot of reading, trying to figure this thing out, and there's one particular book or one scholar who caught my attention. His name is Johann Hari. He's not Jewish, but he wrote a book that I think is particularly relevant. His book is called Chasing the Scream. And he offers that the physical dependency is only part of the equation when it comes to addiction. Another major component is connection. He quotes the theories of a psychologist on addiction by the name of Bruce Alexander, and he says, today's flood of addiction is occurring because of our hyper-individualistic, frantic, crisis-ridden society that makes people feel socially and culturally isolated. Chronic isolation causes people to look for relief. They find temporary relief in addiction because it allows them to escape their feelings, to deaden their senses, and to experience an addictive lifestyle as a substitute for a full life. If we aren't able to find the bonds that we need in life, this theory offers that we bond with a behavior, be it looking at our cell phones all the time, smoking crack, or gambling. Hari reminds us that physical dependence plays a role in the lives of those who suffer from addiction, but another key actor is the lack of supporting life connections. And you know, this is why I believe that that wedding couple, those recovering alcoholics and recovering addicts, found something special in each other. They'd replaced their connection to drugs with a connection to each other, a connection in love. This very same couple shared with me that their friend groups have changed, that they only hang out with sober people because there's far too much temptation and pressure from the people who they used to spend time with, people who fueled their addiction. They need connections that don't enable their usage, but enable them to live happily sober. And I noticed recently at a wedding that I attended the exact same thing. One of my friends had recently confided to me that he was struggling with alcoholism and that his marriage was in shambles because of it. And at the wedding, our mutual friend drank seltzer. He was drinking seltzer the entire night. Friends around him wanted him to drink whiskey and tequila and to have a beer with him. Their old friend loved to party, but their old friend loved to party because he had a drinking problem. Struggling to hold his marriage together, he was trying as hard as he could to stay sober in this hostile drinking environment. They couldn't understand his sobriety. So I myself grabbed a seltzer, stood with him, and started a conversation to make him feel just a little more comfortable. Now, when I think about it a little harder, I realize sometimes the Jewish world can feel the very same way. Our favorite word is l'chaim, and we make drinking into a tradition just as important as prayer itself. Shame on us. Shame on us. Addiction can't be cured with the just say no attitude as Nancy Reagan had suggested in the 1980s. It's not anywhere near that simple. There's a reason why drug abuse soared in the 80s instead of subsided. Society couldn't understand that it's not just about making a choice to say no and not to take drugs, or just to say no and put down that drink. Things aren't that black and white. And in fact, it reminds me of something that our Torah portion says that we're going to read this very morning. Natati lefanecha bracha uklala. I've set before you a blessing and a curse, Moses tells the people. Uvacharta b'chaim, uvacharta bracha. Choose the blessing. It's like setting before an alcoholic a drink, or a choice between a drink and not having a drink. Just saying no for an alcoholic isn't a real choice. Addiction is a gray area of choice, where one's agency is diminished by the addiction itself. Addiction is a disease with no perfect cure, just solutions and endless roads to recovery. Anyone with an addiction needs the support of community. They need it to nourish them. A community that doesn't make drinking 4 cups of wine mandatory. A tradition, or a community that doesn't make it a mitzvah to drink until you're incapacitated. And I believe that the Jewish community also needs to play this role. We pride ourselves on our inclusivity, but we often forget about individuals who are struggling like alcoholics and addicts. We can do better. People have pointed out to me that most of the churches in our community host AA meetings or some sort of 12-step program. We do not, in fact. Well, most synagogues, I should say, don't have AA programs. Most synagogues don't have 12-step programs for the very ugly reality that we believe that none of our Jewish community are addicts or alcoholics. We're in denial, and we have been in denial. We have, I'm going to say it again, just as many people who suffer from alcoholism and addiction compared to any other community out here or in our country. This Yom Kippur, as we work on Teshuvah, I want to speak to several groups of people who are in here, because there are multiple different groups who need to make Teshuvah. The first is I want to speak to anyone who might be struggling with any kind of addiction. We are a resource for you. The cantor and I are people who you can come and talk to confidentially and get spiritual guidance. We're also here to connect you to our local community's resources. If you think you have a problem, there's literature on the table outside with AA and 12-step programs in Suffolk County. The fellowship that's found in these groups is transformative. The fellowship that you'll find is teshuvah. It's making that repentance, that turning in your life, that turning your life around. A friend of mine who is 4 years sober told me this about his experience in AA. He said, the best part about being sober is being sober. He says, I remember things that actually happen. I can be a part of my family again. There's a whole sober community and a whole sober world. I struggle within my work environment because of the continued stigma. It's ironic, he says, because I feel great, but people think I'm lame. They say, just have one drink, you'll give more fun. And then he says, AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, has given me the tools to be able to say, I'm fine. Find your community that will help you sober up, and find your community that will help you stay sober. Now, for family and friends of those who suffer from alcoholism and addictions, know that you are not alone, that we care about you too. I heard a story earlier this summer from a local resident in East Hampton who said that when her neighbor's son was diagnosed with cancer, the entire community rushed to support them, bringing them meals and making house visits. But when her son became an addict, no one would talk to her again. Shame. Call on us. We will help you. We'll send our caring community to bring you meals. We will support you. We will help you, connect you to the resources in the East Hampton community. Don't be afraid. And don't be afraid to find support groups for you as well. There are support groups specifically for family members of alcoholics and addicts. Outside, you'll find information about JACS, the Jewish Alcoholics, Chemically Dependent Persons, and Significant Others Group. It's a program that assists Jewish alcoholics, addicts, and their families. And also, by the way, don't be afraid later today when we say a prayer for healing, the Misha Beirach. Don't be afraid to stand up and say the name of a loved one who suffers from alcoholism or addiction. We are here to help heal. And lastly, to our community, we can make teshuvah as well. We can do better to acknowledge that our families and our communities do suffer from alcoholism and addiction. We can make sure that Judaism not only doesn't exclude those who are alcoholics and addicts, but we can make sure that our synagogue and our Jewish community play an active role in aiding in their recovery. If you're out there and you're thinking, this sermon isn't for me, I'm not an addict, I'm not an alcoholic, I promise you that you know someone who is. You just might not be aware of it. And this sermon is precisely for you because it speaks to our collective community's need to adapt to meet the needs of a group in our community that might number as high as 10%. I'll end by asking those very same questions that I started with at the beginning. Who by fire and who by water? Who by heroin and who by fentanyl? Who by Oxycontin and who by alcohol? Who will be addicted and who will be connected? Who will be sober and who will relapse? Who will feel at ease and who will be high? Who will choose their addiction over their family and whose families will be a support through recovery? Whose community shall be a support? And which communities will remain in denial? Gamar Chatima Tova.